Okay, so now we can kind of get into our main topic of focus today, and that's the Solow model, named after Robert Solow. And I should say that although Joan Robinson didn't win the Nobel Prize, Robert Solow did. He was one of the earlier winners of the Nobel Prize in economics. Now, in fact, I should also say Robert Solow is still alive today. I think he's 95 years old and, still writing, still providing commentary. Very interesting guy. The other name I have here is Swan. This is Trevor Swan, who independently developed a very similar model to Solow's. I think it was published about a year after. And so sometimes you refer to this model, or you hear it referred to as the Solow-Swan model, but I'd say about 50% of the time you refer to it, or hear it referred to as just the Solow model. But for the sake of completeness and for the sake of giving Trevor Swan his credit, this is the Solow-Swan model. So, like I said before, this model was really a reaction to the Harrod-Domar model. If you read the paper that Solow wrote, in the first paragraphs, that's exactly what he talks about. And maybe for good reason too, right? Because we talked about these two instability problems, and in reality, they don't seem to be happening, right? In reality, it doesn't seem like unemployment is constantly rising or constantly falling. And so, as a result, Solow comes around and says, these kind of implications are at odds with reality, so maybe I can do better. Maybe I can come up with a model where growth is not unstable, and we don't have those two problems that we saw in the Harrod-Domar model. And that's what he does with his 1956 article in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. And okay, so he wants to avoid this instability. Well, how's he going to do it? So what does he do differently? He does two things, okay? One is, and he makes a big deal about this, one is that he assumes a neoclassical or marginalist production function. Okay, that's essentially the production function we've seen up until now. So when you go back and look at the theory of the firm, that's a neoclassical or a marginalist production function. I'll talk more about that on the next slide. And the other thing he does is he assumes full employment. Okay, so all capital is being used and labor supply is equal to labor demand. Okay, and so, you can see right away here how he avoids some of this instability. If one of the problems with the Harrod-Domar model is that you get these cases where unemployment is constantly falling or constantly rising, well, he just almost assumes that away, right? He says, remember, we're in the long run, and in the long run, there is no unemployment, so therefore, all capital is being used, all labor is being employed. We don't have these problems. So he gets away, or he does away with some of the instability almost just by assumption here. Well, I'll talk more about that in a second. But let's start with this neoclassical production function. So this is from Solow's article. He says, a remarkable characteristic of the Harrod-Domar model is that it consistently studies long-run problems with the usual short-run tools. Okay, remember we talked about this already, that according to these neoclassical synthesis Keynesians, like Solow, in the short run, we can talk about unemployment and aggregate demand, but in the long run, that doesn't exist. In the long run, wages and prices change to clear markets, supply will be equal to demand, and so we can't use these short-run tools. Just forget about aggregate demand, okay? And so, he says, one usually thinks of the long run as the domain of the neoclassical analysis, okay, the marginalist analysis. And in particular, he says, I suppose that the single composite commodity, that's just output, okay? I assume that output is produced by labor and capital under the standard neoclassical assumptions. So what are the standard neoclassical assumptions? As I mentioned, these are just all the assumptions on the production function we saw already in the theory of the firm, okay? So you have a production function that looks something like this, okay? And then you have all those assumptions we talked about, decreasing marginal product, constant returns to scale, all those things. All the things we talked about in the theory of the firm. That's what he's going to assume. Okay? And why is this important? Well, Solow claims that Harrod and Domar implicitly assume a constant proportions technology. Okay? What's that? Well, here's an example of a constant proportions technology. Is that output is equal to Z, our technology parameter, times the minimum of AK and BN. Okay? Now, what's important here is this technology implies that I need K and N to be in a specific ratio. okay? So let me give you an example. Imagine I'm a firm that does computer programming, okay? So I employ workers, and then my capital is computers. My workers work on computers. Well, this could be an example of a constant proportions technology, right? I need one computer per worker. Okay, each worker needs a computer to do their computer programming on. If I have more workers than computers, say, if I only have 50 computers and 100 workers, well, 50 of those workers can't do anything. That's the argument. And vice versa, if I have more computers than I do people, okay, so let's say I have 100 computers and only 50 people, well, 50 of those computers aren't going to be any use. There's no one to work on them. They'll just sit in a room somewhere. No one will be working on them. That's the idea. And so, imagine, as I just said, this ratio is 1-to-1. That's what I have here, right? Is that the amount I produce with one computer and one person is going to be the same as if I have two computers and one person, right? Because one of those computers just won't be used. Likewise, if I have 3 computers and one person, again, it just produces the same amount as if I have one of each. So if you graph that production function in the same way that we did earlier, it looks something like this, right? So imagine here that, I don't know, k is 10. I have 10 computers, okay? As I increase the number of workers I have, if the number of workers is below 10, each time I increase workers, I add sort of one more worker to a computer, okay? And so for a while here, as I increase workers, it has a positive effect on my output. Once I get to this specific ratio, in our case, 1-to-1, adding additional workers does nothing, okay? This is kind of this argument I said already. And so Solow says a lot of this instability that they're getting is coming from this constant proportions production function that they're assuming. And so where do you see that kind of constant proportions production function? Well, remember that a lot of the Harrodian instability we talked about comes from firms trying to kind of target a specific capital to output ratio. And so Solow interprets this as being, well, firms need a certain amount of capital to produce a given amount of output. This constant proportions. And so that's what he's talking about here. Now, the other thing, which I think is far more important, and I mentioned already, is that Solow is going to assume full employment. Okay? So he says everything is the neoclassical side of the coin. Most especially, it's full employment economics. All the rigidities and difficulties which go into Keynesian income analysis have been shunted away. I got rid of them, he says. We're just going to assume full employment. Why? He says, well, because the real return to factors will adjust to bring about full employment of labor and capital, so we can use the production function to find current rate of output. And so this is what I mentioned before, right? In the Keynesian analysis, output is determined by demand, how much demand there is for goods and services. In this case, we forget about demand. And suddenly now output is going to be supply determined. Okay, so output is produced by our production function, which employs capital and labor. And so output will be supply determined. It's going to be determined by how much capital I have, how much labor supply I have, and what my rate of technology is, Z. That's how we're going to find output. And furthermore, how output is going to grow will be due to the growth in these factors. Again, we're forgetting about demand. All that matters is the growth of supply. All that matters is the growth in labor supply, the growth in capital, and the growth in Z. Those things are going to be what determines the growth of output. And finally, putting this on our little diagram we had before, look at what this means, is that, we're forgetting about aggregate demand. It's just going to be equal to our productive capacity, which is given by the production function.